Dust kicked up from the muzzle brake, coating Commander Nolan Croft's teeth in grit before the sound even hit his ears. It wasn't the crack of a standard rifle. It was the concussive, chest-caving boom of a custom. .416 tearing the atmosphere in half. He was her commander. He gave the orders. But as that chunk of hot brass flew, his radio was dead silent. He had no idea what Sarah Collins had just fired at. 3 kilometers out, something was about to die. 72 hours lying in a depression of jagged shale and dried goat dung changes the fundamental architecture of a human body. Sarah Collins shifted her weight, millimeter by agonizing millimeter. A sharp pop echoed in the microscopic space between her right hip bone and the unforgiving Afghan rock. Her joints felt like crushed glass grinding against frayed tendons. She didn't wince. Wincing wasted energy, and energy was a currency she was rapidly running out of. Beneath her chest, the coarse netting of her ghillie suit was fused to her skin by a glue of 3-day-old sweat and fine, talcum-like dust. The smell inside the hide was deeply feral. It was the sharp ammonia of human urine baking in plastic bottles, the metallic tang of gun oil, and the sour, ketone-laced breath of dehydration. Nobody warns snipers about the smell in school. Instructors show the math. They teach the breathing. But they don't explain how intimately shooters will come to know the scent of their own slow decay. Commander Nolan Croft lay 18 inches to her left. His face was pressed into the rubber eye cup of a high-powered spotting scope. Croft was a machine of a man, built out of rigid doctrines and standard operating procedures, but even machines broke down in this valley. Collins could hear the shallow, ragged edges of his breathing. She could smell the stale chewing tobacco he had swallowed by mistake yesterday, sweating out through his pores. "Winds shifting," Croft whispered. His voice was less of a sound and more of a dry rasp against the rocks. "Half value, coming from the east." Collins didn't reply. She kept her right eye locked through the Schmidt and Binder scope. Her cheek was welded to the adjustable stock of the Macmillan TAC 416. The rifle wasn't just a tool anymore. After 3 days, it felt like a heavy, cold appendage grafted onto her collarbone. Her fingers were numb, the cuticles cracked and bleeding into the Nomex fabric of her gloves. Boredom is the sniper's greatest predator. It eats away at the sanity, making the mind see shadows moving in the rocks, convincing a tired brain that a scrub brush is a crouching insurgent. To fight it, Collins played games with her sensory inputs. She focused on the feeling of the blood pulsing in her right eyelid. She mapped the exact texture of the trigger against the pad of her index finger. A curve of anodized aluminum, slightly warm, dusted with a single grain of sand she hadn't been able to wipe away. She was the first woman to earn this specific Overwatch billet in her Tier 1 element. That fact usually hovered over her like a suffocating blanket, a constant pressure to be flawless, to be an unblinking, unfeeling weapon. But out here, staring down into the Hindu Kush, gender was irrelevant. The mountain didn't care. The wind didn't care. The only thing that mattered was the math and the fragile, exhausted meat sack trying to calculate it. "You hydrating, Collins?" Croft asked, not taking his eye off the glass. "Negative," she murmured, her lips cracking as she spoke. She tasted copper. "Tubes blocked. Silt." Croft grunted. A sound of disapproval, but there was nothing to be done. Movement in the hide had to be restricted to absolute zero. If she reached back to clear her camelback line, the shift in the camouflage netting might catch the glare of the brutal afternoon sun. A single flash of reflection would compromise them. So she swallowed the dry paste in her mouth and let the dehydration headache pulse behind her eyes like a metronome. Down below, the valley stretched out like a massive, jagged scar in the earth. It was a chaotic topography of mud brick compounds, winding goat paths and sheer cliffs. The air was heating up, creating a viscous, shimmering mirage over the desert floor. Through her optic, the world looked like it was submerged in boiling water. Her stomach gave a hollow, aggressive growl. She ignored it. Her body was screaming at her to stand up, to stretch, to drink, to sleep. But her mind, a compartmentalized, heavily disciplined vault, locked those signals away. She forced her heart rate down. Inhale for 4. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. Hold for 4. She was a ghost, a very tired, very dirty ghost, and the haunt was about to begin. Movement, Croft hissed. The sudden spike of adrenaline in his voice cut through the lethargy of the hide like a scalpel. Collins felt the immediate, electric jolt in her own veins. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a cold, hyper-focused clarity. Her pupil dilated, absorbing the light filtering through the expensive German glass of her scope. Grid Echo 7, the dry riverbed, Croft instructed, his tone dropping into the clipped, flat cadence of a professional calling a kill. Collins tracked the heavy rifle. The turret clicked against her glove. Click, click, click. She swept the reticle over the shimmering heat waves. 3 kilometers downrange, a convoy of 3 dust-covered Toyota Hilux trucks was kicking up a massive plume of tan dirt. They snaked through the wadi, tires fighting the loose gravel, before coming to a halt near a collapsed stone wall. "I have them," Collins said softly. "Wait for the HVI," Croft ordered. "Intel says he's in the second vehicle. White dish dasher, black tactical vest. He's the one holding the purse strings for the IED network." The doors of the trucks opened. Tiny, pixelated figures spilled out into the heat distortion. At this distance, 3,247 meters, roughly 2 miles, they didn't look like men. They looked like smudged thumbprints moving erratically against the beige canvas of the earth. Collins dialed up her magnification. The mirage worsened, the targets rippling and tearing at the edges, making it incredibly difficult to isolate identifying features. "Target identified," Croft confirmed, his breathing shallow. "Second vehicle. He just stepped out. He's talking to the driver." Collins found him, a tall smudge of white and black, the primary target. He was the reason they had spent 3 days marinating in their own filth. Taking him out would sever the funding for a network that had crippled 3 Marine convoys in the last month. Range 3,247 meters, Croft began, reading the ballistic data off his Kestrel weather meter. Temperature 92 degrees, station pressure 24.1, humidity 18%. Collins's brain went to work, processing the numbers. At this extreme range, the bullet wouldn't just drop, it would be pushed sideways by the spin of its own rifling. She had to account for the Coriolis effect, the literal rotation of the Earth beneath the bullet during its 7-second flight time. "Dialing up 42 mils of elevation," Collins whispered, her fingers spinning the top turret. "Holding left for spin drift." "Wind is a nightmare," Croft grumbled, his eye pressed hard against the glass. "You've got 3 different wind zones between us and him. First 1,000 meters is crosswind, left to right, 5 miles an hour. Middle valley is an updraft. Last 1,000 is a full value, right to left, 10 miles an hour. It was an impossible shot. A shot that relied as much on dark magic and luck as it did on science. Collins settled her crosshairs on the white blur. She prepared her mind for the trigger pull. But then, a strange, creeping sensation clawed at the back of her neck. It wasn't logic. It was raw, unadulterated instinct, the same instinct that had saved her life in a darkened alley in Fallujah 4 years prior. Something in the visual picture was wrong. Her eye left the HVI. Without permission, her fingers worked the windage knob, panning the heavy rifle slightly to the right. "Collins, what are you doing?" Croft snapped, noticing the barrel shift. "Target is stationary." She didn't answer. She swept the scope past the trucks, past the collapsed stone wall, up a slight incline to a cluster of boulders overlooking the meeting site. The mirage was thick here, bouncing off the rocks. She squinted, forcing her aching eye to resolve the image. There, a shadow that didn't match the angle of the sun. "Collins, get back on the primary." Croft's voice was tightening with authority. "Stand by," she breathed. She dialed the magnification to maximum, fighting the heavy distortion. The shadow shifted. It wasn't a rock, it was a tarp. And under the tarp, something tubular and metallic caught a micro-fraction of a sunbeam. Her heart skipped a beat, then slammed against her ribs in double time. It wasn't an RPG, it was an ATGM, an anti-tank guided missile system, heavily camouflaged, pointed directly down the valley gorge. "Commander," Collins said, her voice strained. "Grid Echo 8, Ridgeline, we have an ambush element." Croft cursed, shifting his spotting scope aggressively. "I don't see it. The mirage is too heavy. Stop wasting time, Miller. Get back on the HVI. That is our mission." "They aren't here for a meeting," Collins said, the pieces snapping together in her sleep-deprived brain. The contradictions of the scene suddenly made sense. The trucks were parked too aggressively. The HV. I wasn't looking at his men. He was looking down the gorge. "It's a bait. They're waiting for our quick reaction force. If I shoot the HVI, the QRF rolls in to secure the body, and that missile team wipes out the lead strikers." "You don't know that," Croft argued, the rigid command structure of his brain fighting her chaotic field intuition. "You are guessing. We have direct orders. Target the HVI, now." Collins felt a bead of sweat detach from her eyebrow and roll into her eye, stinging fiercely. She blinked it away, her vision blurring for a terrifying second before snapping back. The man behind the missile system was adjusting the tripod. "If I shoot the HVI, those Marines die in 20 minutes, she said. "If you don't shoot the HVI, you're facing a court-martial," Croft snarled, abandoning all radio etiquette. "I am your commander. I am giving you a direct order. Traverse left and acquire the primary target." It was the ultimate contradiction. Her entire life had been built on following the chain of command. She had sacrificed her body, her personal life, and her peace of mind to become a perfect, obedient instrument of the military. But staring through the glass, smelling the dry dust of the earth, she realized that obedience in this exact moment was synonymous with murder. She looked at the primary target, a clean shot, a career-making shot. She looked at the shadow in the rocks, an impossible target, a sliver of a human silhouette hidden behind a heat wave. "Collins," Croft warned, his hand reaching out, gripping her shoulder tightly. "Do not do this." She let out a long, ragged exhale. The air tasted like rust. "Wind is shifting," Collins whispered, speaking to the atmosphere, not to her commander. "Collins, I swear to God—" "Shut up, Nolan." The use of his first name hit the cramped hide like a physical blow. Croft froze, his hand still gripping her shoulder, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of her insubordination. In that fraction of a second, the hierarchy dissolved. There was no commander, no subordinate. There was only the shooter, the spotter, and the wind. Collins blocked him out. She blocked out the threat of prison, the sting of the sweat in her eye, the agonizing cramp in her lower back. She collapsed her consciousness down into a tunnel that extended from her retina, through the scope, out of the muzzle, and across 3,000 meters of dead space. She focused on the man behind the ATGM. He was wearing a drab olive shirt, blending perfectly with the rocks. He was crouched, his hands manipulating the guidance controls. Distance, 3,310 meters. She spun the elevation turret, maxing it out. It wasn't enough. She would have to use the reticle to hold over the target. She was aiming at the empty blue sky above the mountain. The math. It flooded her brain, messy and imperfect. A .416. Barrett bullet weighs 398 grains. Muzzle velocity, 3,150 feet per second. At this distance, the bullet would travel in a massive parabolic arc, soaring hundreds of feet into the air before crashing back down toward the earth. She read the mirage. The heat waves near the target were boiling straight up. No wind at the impact zone, but the middle valley was tricky. The dust kicked up by the trucks was drifting lazily to the right. Hold 2 mils left for the crosswind. Hold half a mil left for spin drift. Her finger rested against the trigger. It required precisely 2.5 pounds of pressure to brake. Her physical state was a disaster. Her heart was beating at 90 beats per minute. Too fast, too erratic. The crosshairs bounced rhythmically with every pump of blood through her chest. She needed to shoot between the beats. Thump, pause, thump, pause. "You're going to miss," Croft hissed, his voice trembling, not with anger, but with an underlying, terrifying realization of what she was attempting. "It's too far. The target is too small. If you miss, you spook the HVI, and we lose everything." He was right. The statistical probability of hitting a partial human silhouette at 2 miles on the first round was astronomically low. It was the sniper's equivalent of buying a lottery ticket while falling down a flight of stairs. But Collins felt a strange, chilling calm wash over her. It wasn't heroism. It was a bleak, cynical acceptance of consequence. If she missed, her life was over. If she hit it, her career was likely still over for disobeying a direct order. She had nothing left to lose except the lives of the Marines who didn't even know they were walking into a trap. She settled into her natural respiratory pause, the moment at the absolute bottom of an exhale, when the lungs are empty and the body achieves a fraction of a second of true stillness. Breathe in. The crosshairs dropped. Breathe out. The crosshairs rose, floating through the heat mirage, settling into the empty sky, exactly 2 miles left and 5 mils high of the shadow in the rocks. Her finger applied 1 pound of pressure. The aluminum trigger bit into her skin. Her mind calculated the final variable. The Earth was rotating. In the 7.5 seconds, the bullet would be in the air. The target would physically move with the rotation of the planet. Right edge of the target. Hold there. Her heartbeat. Thump. The crosshair jumped. It settled back down. Pause. She applied the final 1.5 pounds of pressure. The break of the trigger surprised her, exactly as it was supposed to. The rifle didn't just fire, it detonated. The recoil was a violent physical assault. The heavy rifle drove back into her shoulder pocket with the force of a sledgehammer, bruising the muscle instantly. The muzzle brake violently redirected the explosive gases sideways, kicking up a blinding cloud of dust, shale, and debris inside the hide. The concussive shockwave slapped her face, rattling her teeth in her gums and temporarily deafening her right ear, leaving behind a shrill, whining pitch. Croft flinched violently, ripping his eye away from the spotting scope, coughing through the sudden cloud of pulverized earth. "Fuck!" he choked out, the professionalism shattering completely. Collins didn't move. She fought the recoil, muscling the heavy rifle back down, forcing her eye to stay in the scope. She had to follow through. She had to spot her own trace. The silence in the hide was absolute, save for the ringing in her ears and Croft's ragged breathing. 1 second. The bullet was traveling at Mach 2.8, ripping a vacuum through the air. 2 seconds. It crossed the 1,000-meter mark, fighting the crosswind, beginning to scrub off velocity. 3 seconds. "What did you do?" Croft demanded, his voice bordering on panic as he desperately tried to find the target through his dust-covered lens. "Collins, what the hell did you shoot at?" 4 seconds. The bullet reached the apex of its massive arc, high above the valley, hanging in the thin atmosphere before gravity violently reclaimed it. 5 seconds. Collins stared unblinking into the scope. The mirage was so bad. Her eye was watering. The muscles in her neck burned with lactic acid. 6 seconds. The bullet was slowing down. It was dropping transonic, shedding the sonic boom, destabilizing slightly as it hit the thicker air near the valley floor. 7 seconds. Please, she thought, the single, raw, imperfect prayer of a cynic. Just hit the damn rock. 7.5 seconds. Through the scope, 3,000 meters away, the shadow behind the ATGM suddenly ceased to exist. There was no cinematic splash of red. There was no dramatic flailing of limbs. At that distance, through the heavy mirage, the human body simply absorbed the kinetic energy of a 398-grain projectile falling from the sky. The figure violently folded in on itself, collapsing forward like a puppet with its strings abruptly severed, dragging the heavy metal tripod of the missile system down with it into the dust. Collins let out her breath. It shuddered past her lips, a pathetic, weak sound in the cramped hide. Croft had finally found the rocks in his spotting scope. He went entirely rigid. The breath hitched in his throat. He stared through the glass for 3 agonizingly long seconds. He slowly pulled away from the eyepiece. He looked at Collins. His face was caked in dirt, his eyes wide, reflecting a mixture of profound shock, fury, and reluctant awe. Down in the valley, the men by the trucks hadn't even heard the gunshot yet. It would take another 2 seconds for the sound of the rifle to reach them. Collins racked the bolt of the TAC-416. The massive, smoking brass casing ejected, tumbling over her shoulder and clinking softly against the rocks. The smell of burnt powder filled the hide, sharp and toxic. She pushed a fresh round into the chamber and locked the bolt down. She didn't look at Croft. "Target neutralized," she whispered, her voice dead flat. "Adjusting for primary." Time stretched into something unrecognizable. Down in the valley, the world was still operating on a delay. The HVY, that white blur of a man, was still talking to his driver, completely unaware that the topography of his war had just violently shifted. 2 miles away, the ATGM operator was a crumpled heap of dead weight, but the sound of his execution hadn't arrived yet. 9.4 seconds. That is how long it takes the acoustic shockwave of a .416 Barrett to travel 3,247 meters through the thin Afghan air. Collins watched the valley through the scope. The silence in her headset was oppressive. Croft was breathing hard, a wet, rattling sound in the back of his throat. He had the spotting scope locked onto the primary target now, waiting for the physics to catch up to the reality. Then the echo hit the valley floor. It didn't sound like a gunshot down there. It sounded like a localized thunderclap, a low, rolling boom that reverberated off the canyon walls and folded back in on itself. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely chaotic. Through the Schmidt and Bender glass, Collins watched the pixelated figures flinch as a collective organism. The HVI's head snapped up. The driver ducked. Two men standing by the rear Hilux dropped to the dirt, throwing their hands over their heads. They had no idea where the sound came from. Sniper fire from extreme distances creates an acoustic illusion. The crack of the bullet passing overhead arrives before the boom of the muzzle, making the targets think the shooter is in the opposite direction. "They're spooked," Croft barked. The hesitation, the shock of her insubordination, was gone. The machine had rebooted. He was the spotter again. "Target is scrambling. He's going for the cab of the second truck. Range 3,200. He's moving right to left." Collins tracked him. The heavy rifle swung smoothly on its bipod. Her shoulder throbbed with a dull, sickening ache from the first shot. The recoil pad had dug a trough into her collarbone, and she knew the second pull was going to tear the bruised muscle. She didn't care. The cynical part of her brain, the part that kept her alive, knew that if she let the HVI escape after saving the QRF, the brass would crucify her. She had to deliver the body. "Wind is full value right to left. Target is moving at roughly 3 meters per second, Croft called out, his voice a rapid-fire string of data. "Hold left edge of the lead vehicle. Wait for him to cross." She dragged the crosshairs ahead of the sprinting white blur. The HVI was fast. He was making a desperate, scrambling dash for the passenger door of the Hilux. "Send it," Croft ordered. Collins didn't have time to find the bottom of her breath. She didn't have time for the perfect respiratory pause. She dragged the trigger straight back, an ugly, hurried squeeze. The rifle detonated again. The violence of it was blinding. The scope slammed back toward her eye, stopping a 1/4 inch from her orbital bone. Dust rained down from the camouflage netting above her, coating the back of her neck in a fine, gritty powder. She forced the barrel down. The trace of the bullet cut a visible vapor trail through the mirage. It was flying lower this time, a flatter trajectory against the valley wall. 7 seconds. The HVI grabbed the door handle of the Hilux. He pulled it open, his body turning sideways to dive into the cab. 7.2 seconds. The 398-grain solid brass bullet slammed into the heavy steel door of the Toyota just as it swung open. It didn't penetrate clean. At that distance, the bullet had lost a massive amount of its kinetic energy. It struck the reinforced hinges, shattering the metal and fragmenting into jagged secondary shrapnel. Collins watched through the glass as the HVI was violently thrown backward, completely off his feet by the sheer concussive force of the impact and the spray of fragmented steel. He hit the dirt hard, a tangle of white fabric and dust. "Impact," Croft said, his voice flat. "Looks like a secondary hit. Shrapnel. Target is down. He's not moving." Down in the valley, the remaining guards were in full panic. One of them threw a smoke grenade, a pathetic, hissing canister of white smoke that was instantly sheared away by the crosswind. They grabbed the HVI by the collar of his dish dasher, dragging his limp body toward the rocks, abandoning the trucks. "Do we have a confirmed KIA?" Collins asked. Her voice sounded thin, raspy, like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "Unknown," Croft replied, pulling back from the spotting scope. "He's incapacitated. That's enough. The objective is compromised. We need to break down the hide, now. Every fighter within 10 miles heard that point 416, and they know the general elevation." Collins finally took her finger off the trigger guard. She closed her eyes for a single, luxurious second. The darkness behind her eyelids was a relief, but it pulsed with a sickening, neon-red headache. She had done it. She had threaded the needle between court-martial and mass casualty. But there was no elation. There was no surge of heroic triumph. There was only the crushing, unbearable realization that she now had to stand up. Moving a body that has been immobilized for 72 hours is an exercise in pure, unadulterated torture. Collins rolled onto her side. The muscles in her lower back seized immediately, locking up in a rigid, agonizing spasm. She bit down on the inside of her cheek until she tasted the sharp, hot tang of fresh blood. A low, pathetic groan escaped her lips, completely involuntary. "Keep it quiet," Croft snapped, already on his knees. He was tearing down the netting, his movements jerky, aggressive. The professional veneer he had maintained during the shoot was cracking, revealing the furious, tightly wound man underneath. Blood rushed back into Collins's legs. It felt like someone was pouring boiling water through her veins, followed by the jagged puncture of 1,000 needles. She dragged her knees up to her chest, fighting the nausea that rolled over her. "Get up, Sarah," Croft said, his tone devoid of any warmth. He shoved her discarded brass casings into his dump pouch. "If they start mortaring this ridgeline, we are going to die in this hole. Move!" She pushed herself up to her hands and knees. Her wrists popped audibly. The hide smelled heavily of cordite and the sour stench of their own unwashed bodies. She reached for the heavy TAC 416. It weighed 32 pounds, fully loaded. Right now, it felt like it was forged from depleted uranium. She unclipped the bipod and dragged the rifle toward her chest, wrapping the protective canvas drag bag around the long, fluted barrel. Her fingers were clumsy, numb, refusing to manipulate the buckles. Croft reached over and swatted her hands away, violently buckling the straps himself. "I've got it," she muttered, glaring at him through the dirt caked on her eyelashes. "You don't have anything," Croft hissed, leaning in close. His breath was terrible. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown out from adrenaline. "Do not confuse what just happened. You hit the shot. Congratulations. But you disobeyed a direct fire order. You broke the chain. You risked the entire mission profile on a hunch." "It wasn't a hunch," Collins fired back, her voice raspy but hard. The deference she usually paid him was gone, burned away in the crucible of the last 5 minutes. "It was an ATGM, pointed at the gorge. You know exactly what that was." "I know that you don't get to make that call." Croft shoved the drag bag hard against her chest. "I wear the oak leaf. I carry the radio. You are the trigger. You do not pull it until I tell you to. When we get back to Bagram, I am pulling your tridents. You're done, Collins." He turned away, hoisting his massive Eberlestock pack onto his shoulders. Collins knelt there in the dirt, clutching the rifle to her chest. The threat of losing her career, the thing she had bled and starved and fractured her own soul to achieve, should have shattered her. She had spent the last 6 years clawing her way through a system designed to reject her, enduring the silent judgments, the overt skepticism, the physical impossibilities, but sitting in the filth of the hide, listening to the distant, frantic shouting echoing up from the valley floor, she felt absolutely nothing. No regret, no panic, just a cold, heavy exhaustion. "They'd be dead, Nolan," she said to his back. Croft froze. He didn't turn around. His shoulders were rigid under the weight of his pack. "And you'd be following orders. Let's move. We have 12 miles to the exfil point." She slung the drag bag over her back. The strap bit violently into the bruised meat of her shoulder. She grabbed her own assault pack, a heavy mass of water bladders, spare ammunition, and observation gear. She struggled to her feet. Her left knee gave way instantly, buckling under the sudden weight, sending her crashing back down into the jagged shale. The rock sliced through her uniform pants, biting into her kneecap. She didn't cry out. She just rested her forehead against the dirt, breathing in the dust, letting the wave of pain wash over her, peak and recede. "Get up." She pushed off the ground, using a heavy piece of slate for leverage. She stood. Her legs trembled uncontrollably, the muscles protesting violently against the demand. She checked her sidearm, a Glock 19 resting in a Kydex holster on her thigh. She chambered a round, the metallic clack loud in the quiet of the ridge. Croft was already moving, scrambling up the backside of the depression, keeping his profile low beneath the crest of the hill. He wasn't waiting for her. Collins took one last look down into the valley. The dust was settling. The Hilux trucks were abandoned. The world looked exactly as it had an hour ago, completely indifferent to the violence that had just scarred it. She turned her back to the drop and began the climb. The Hindu Kush does not negotiate. It is a vertical, hostile environment, comprised of loose shale, hidden crevasses, and a biting wind that strips the moisture from a soldier's lungs. For the first 3 miles, Collins operated on pure adrenaline. Her body flushed the fear and the physical trauma with cortisol, turning her into a numb, lumbering machine. She focused entirely on the heels of Croft's boots ahead of her. Step, slip, catch, push. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, the temperature plummeted. In less than 40 minutes, it went from a blistering 90 degrees to the low 50s. The sweat that soaked her base layers turned icy, clinging to her skin like a wet shroud. She began to shiver, deep, core-shaking tremors that rattled her teeth. "Hold," Croft whispered, dropping to a knee behind an outcropping of grey rock. Collins collapsed against the stone next to him, her chest heaving. The air was too thin up here. Her lungs burned with every intake. She reached blindly for the camelback tube clipped to her rig, biting down on the valve. The water was lukewarm and tasted heavily of plastic and iodine, but as it hit the back of her parched throat, it was the greatest thing she had ever experienced. She drank too fast, her stomach cramping violently in rebellion. She forced herself to stop, panting. Croft had the encrypted radio handset pulled from his rig. He pressed it to his ear, his face illuminated by the faint, eerie green glow of the dials. "Havoc Base, this is Overwatch 1. Radio check over." The static hissed, a localized sound in the vast emptiness of the mountains. Then a voice cracked through. Clean, clinical, completely detached from the dirt and the blood. "Overwatch 1, Havoc Base. We read you Lima Charlie. Be advised. Drone feed confirms primary target was extracted by hostile elements. Status unknown. Blood trails indicate severe trauma. Good effect on target." Croft glanced at Collins. His eyes were shadowed, unreadable. "Copy that, Havoc," Croft said. "Overwatch 1, be advised," the operator continued, the bored cadence of a man sitting in an air-conditioned tent hundreds of miles away. QRF element rolling through grid, Echo 8 reported a secondary explosion. Looks like an ATGM, malfunctioned in the rocks above the road. QRF is clear and proceeding to objective rally point. "You guys missed the fireworks." Collins closed her eyes. She leaned her head back against the cold stone. A bitter, jagged laugh threatened to claw its way out of her throat. An ATGM malfunctioned. The military machine had already rewritten the narrative. To the analysts back at base, studying the pixelated thermal feeds of a Predator drone, a man had simply blown himself up in the rocks. They didn't see the 398-grain piece of brass fall from the sky. They didn't see the impossible math. They didn't see her insubordination. "Copy, Havoc," Croft said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "We are Oscar Mike to exfil. Expected arrival, 0400. He clicked the radio off. The silence rushed back in, heavy and oppressive. He didn't look at her. He busied himself restowing the handset, checking his GPS tracker, adjusting the straps on his pack. "Nolan," Collins rasped. "Shut up, Collins," he said softly. It wasn't an order this time. It sounded tired. The anger had burned out, leaving only the exhaustion of a man who realized the system he worshipped was flawed. "They think it was a malfunction," she pushed, the cynicism pooling in her chest. Croft finally stopped. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the blood dried on her cheek from biting her own mouth, the cracked lips, the dead, hollow stare of a sniper who had looked through the glass too long. "The drone didn't catch the first shot," Croft said slowly, measuring his words. "The drone was focused on the primary target. As far as the TOC is concerned, you fired 2 rounds at the HVI. 1 missed, 1 fragmented on the door." Collins stared at him, the reality of his words slowly sinking through the fog of her exhaustion. He was giving her an out. He was doctoring the report. The rigid, by-the-book commander was lying to the chain of command. "Why?" she asked. "Because you were right," Croft said, turning his face away, staring out into the darkening canyon. "I missed the ambush. I was too locked onto the objective. If you had listened to me, 20 Marines would be burning in those strikers right now." He picked up his rifle. "But if you ever pull the trigger without my authorization again, I will shoot you myself. Are we clear?" "Clear," she whispered. "Drink your water. We have 8 miles left." They stood up. The night swallowed them completely. There were no stars, just a heavy, suffocating overcast. Collins adjusted the heavy drag bag on her shoulders. Her body was breaking down, her joints grinding, her muscles tearing with every step. But as they began the agonizing descent into the dark, the suffocating weight of the trident on her chest felt just a fraction lighter. She wasn't a hero. She was just a ghost, walking off a mountain, carrying the weight of the math and the dirt and the dead. Step, slip, catch, push. The rhythm took over. The valley faded away. There was only the long, dark walk home. Sarah Collins dragged her left foot. It wasn't a conscious choice. The cartilage in her knee had swollen to the point where the joint simply refused to articulate. Every time she swung the leg forward, her boot scraped the loose shale, sending a tiny cascade of pebbles tumbling down into the black void below them. "Pick your feet up," Croft whispered over the internal comms. His voice was a digitized crackle in her earpiece. "Trying," she grunted back, the word costing her precious oxygen. They had been walking for 6 hours. The adrenaline that had propelled her off the ridge had metabolized hours ago, leaving behind a toxic sludge of lactic acid and pure physical despair. The ambient temperature was hovering near freezing. Her sweat-soaked base layers clung to her ribs like a layer of ice. The 32-pound TAC-416, strapped to her back, had slowly excavated a deep purple trench across her collarbone. She could feel the fabric of her uniform fused to the skin there, cemented by dried blood and plasma. She focused entirely on the green glow of the infrared strobe attached to the back of Croft's helmet. It was a rhythmic, pulsing beacon in the sea of static. Blink, blink, blink. She synchronized her breathing to it. It was the only way to stop her mind from spiraling into the desperate, animalistic panic of exhaustion. The terrain flattened out slightly as they descended below the snowline, transitioning from jagged rock to loose, sandy scree. It was like walking on a treadmill made of ball bearings. For every 2 steps forward, she slid 1 step back. Suddenly, the green strobe stopped. Collins almost walked right into Croft's back. She caught herself, her bad knee buckling instantly. She dropped into a heavy kneel, her rifle stock slamming into the dirt. "What?" she breathed, her hand instinctively dropping to the grip of her sidearm. Croft didn't answer over the radio. He raised a closed fist in the darkness. Freeze. Collins killed her breathing. She opened her mouth wide to equalize the pressure in her ears, straining to listen over the high-pitched, incessant whine of tinnitus the .416 had permanently gifted her. At first, there was only the wind cutting through the gorge. Then she heard it. It was a soft, rhythmic crunch. Footsteps, multiple pairs, unhurried, methodical, and close. Croft slowly lowered his hand and tapped his own shoulder twice. Enemy patrol. He pointed down, indicating the dry creek bed running parallel to their position, about 40 yards below. Collins shifted her NVGs, scanning the darkness. The phosphor tubes flared slightly as they picked up ambient starlight bouncing off the rocks. There, 5 distinct thermal anomalies moving through the wadi. They were local fighters, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They had no night vision. They were navigating by memory and the faint moonlight fighting through the cloud cover. They were directly between Collins and the extraction zone. Croft slid his suppressed M4 rifle off his chest. The movement was agonizingly slow, calculated to produce absolutely zero friction against his gear. He looked back at Collins. Even through the grainy green filter of the optics, she could read the cold calculus in his posture. If the patrol turned up the embankment, they would have to kill them all. 5 targets, suppressed weapons. It would be messy, loud, and it would draw every fighter in the valley down on their heads. Collins drew her Glock. She didn't bother unslinging the massive sniper rifle. It was completely useless in a close-quarters engagement. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the brutal neurological fatigue. The front sight post of the pistol danced erratically in her vision. She clamped her left hand over her right, squeezing until her knuckles went white, forcing the weapon steady. Breathe in. Hold. The patrol stopped. The lead fighter raised a hand, pointing up the embankment, pointing directly at the outcropping where Collins and Croft were huddled. Collins felt her stomach drop into her boots. Her finger slid inside the trigger guard, resting against the cold polymer. She picked her target, the man in the rear, carrying a heavy belt-fed machine gun. If the shooting started, he had to die first. One of the fighters spoke. The language was Pashto, the dialect thick and guttural. He kicked at the dirt, gestured to the sky, and shook his head. The lead fighter spat on the ground. He adjusted the sling of his AK-47 and continued walking down the wadi, away from the embankment. They hadn't seen them. They were just arguing about the route. Collins kept her gun raised until the last thermal signature faded into the rocks. It took another full minute before Croft finally lowered his rifle and let out a long, slow breath that fogged the lens of his night vision. 5 miles, he whispered, standing up slowly. They didn't speak again until the low, rhythmic thumping of rotor blades vibrated through the soles of their boots. The exfil bird, an M-60M Blackhawk, was coming in totally blacked out, flying nap of the earth to avoid radar and visual detection. They popped a single infrared chem light, tossing it onto the flat expanse of the LZ. The helicopter flared hard, the massive downwash kicking up a blinding, choking cloud of sand and grit. Collins turned her face away, coughing as the dust coated her teeth and stung her eyes. The crew chief hung out the side door, his own NVGs glowing ominously. He grabbed Croft by the harness, hauling him into the cabin. Collins followed, throwing her heavy pack in first, then dragging herself over the aluminum lip of the floorboard. She collapsed onto the jump seat. She didn't bother strapping in. The helicopter banked violently, accelerating away from the mountain, leaving the valley and its ghosts behind in the dark. Collins unclipped her helmet and pulled it off, letting it hit the deck. The cabin smelled of JP-8 jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the clean metallic tang of the miniguns mounted on the windows. It was the smell of the machine, the smell of the system. She looked across the cabin at Croft. He was slumped against the bulkhead, his eyes closed, his face caked in a mask of dirt and dried sweat. He looked 10 years older than he had 3 days ago. The flight mechanic handed her a plastic bottle of water. It was freezing cold. She unscrewed the cap with trembling fingers and drank. It tasted like absolute heaven. It tasted like survival. But as she stared out the open door into the blackness of the Afghan sky, the high-pitched ringing in her right ear flared up again, a permanent physical reminder of the trigger pull. The mountain hadn't let her go, not entirely. Fluorescent lighting is actively hostile to a body that has lived in the dirt for 3 days. It doesn't illuminate, it interrogates. The debriefing room at Bagram Airfield was a windowless plywood box inside a massive, climate-controlled tent. The air conditioning was cranked to a sub-Arctic level, blasting recycled air that smelled of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and ozone. Collins sat in a metal folding chair. She had been through medical. The docs had cut her ghillie suit off with trauma shears because the fabric had fused to the wounds on her shoulders and knees. They had scrubbed the grit out of her abrasions with stiff brushes and iodine, a process that hurt substantially more than acquiring the injuries in the first place. Now she was wearing a clean, oversized grey t-shirt and loose sweatpants. She felt small, fragile, and utterly exposed without the weight of her armor. Croft sat next to her. He had showered, but he hadn't shaved. The dark stubble on his jaw made the hollows of his cheeks look even deeper. He stared straight ahead at the whiteboard on the far wall. Major Hayes walked into the room carrying a manila folder. He was an intelligence officer, a man whose war was fought on flat screens and spreadsheets. His uniform was crisp. His fingernails were clean. He smelled like generic aftershave and laundry detergent. "Commander Croft, Petty Officer Collins," Hayes said, dropping the folder onto the cheap folding table. "Hell of a walk back from what I hear." "It was a walk, sir," Croft replied, his voice completely monotone. Hayes sat down. He opened the folder. Inside were high-resolution thermal prints taken from the Predator drone feed. "Let's get right to it," Hayes said, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the table. "The HVI is confirmed KIA. Ground assets moved in after daybreak. The fragmentation from the vehicle door severed his femoral artery. He bled out in the rocks before his men could evac him. Good work." Collins stared at the edge of the table. The laminate was peeling slightly at the corner. She didn't feel pride. She felt the phantom recoil of the .416 punching her shoulder. "However," Hayes continued, flipping to a second photo, "we have an anomaly we need to square away for the after-action report." He pushed a grainy black-and-white print across the table. It showed the ridgeline above the valley, exactly where the ATGM had been set up. The image was a messy bloom of white heat. An explosion. QRF reported a secondary detonation in the rocks a few minutes before they rolled through, Hayes said, tapping the photo with a pen. EOD pushed up there today. They found the remains of a Cornet anti-tank missile system and pieces of a local fighter. The official assessment is a catastrophic malfunction of the missile's propellant during setup. It cooked off in the tube. Hayes looked up, his eyes darting between Croft and Collins. But the drone audio sensors picked up a massive acoustic anomaly right before the HVI started running. Sounded like heavy caliber fire, and it didn't come from the valley floor. The room went dead silent. The hum of the air conditioner suddenly sounded like a jet engine. Collins felt her heart rate spike. The lie was sitting right there, heavy and ugly in the middle of the table. She opened her mouth to speak, to just tear the Band-Aid off and accept the court-martial, but Croft beat her to it. "That was us, sir," Croft said, his voice steady, entirely devoid of hesitation. Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "Petty Officer Collins was on the glass," Croft lied smoothly. It was a terrifying thing to witness. How easily a man built entirely on integrity could fabricate a reality. She acquired the primary target. I gave the green light. She took the shot. Wind shifted violently in the middle valley. The round missed the HVY by a wide margin. It impacted high, up in the rocks. Croft pointed to the photo of the explosion. "Must have struck the ATGM system directly. Sparks from the brass solid hitting the rock, or direct kinetic impact to the warhead. It set off the missile. The sound of the explosion spooked the HVI. He ran for the truck. Collins cycled the bolt. I adjusted her windage, and she put the second round through the door." Hayes stared at Croft for a long, calculating moment. He looked at the photo, then back to the SEAL commander. A 398-grain bullet, traveling 3 kilometers, accidentally hits a camouflaged missile system hiding in the rocks, Hayes asked, his tone dripping with profound skepticism. "That is a hell of a statistical anomaly, Commander." "It's a big bullet, sir," Croft said flatly. "And it's a very big mountain. Sometimes the math just falls that way." Hayes shifted his gaze to Collins. His eyes were cold, boring into her, trying to find the crack in the facade. "Is that how it happened, Collins?" Hayes asked softly. "You missed a static target by 400 vertical feet." Collins looked at Major Hayes. She looked at his clean hands. She thought about the 20 Marines in the Stryker convoy who were currently eating hot chow in the mess hall, completely ignorant of the fact that they were supposed to be burning in a canyon. She thought about the smell of the hide, the taste of copper and dust. She looked at Croft. He didn't turn his head, but she saw the microscopic tightening of his jaw. He had put his trident, his pension, and his freedom on the line to protect her. Not because he liked her, but because she had been right. "Yes, sir," Collins said, her voice raspy, damaged from the dehydration. "I misread the updraft, pulled the shot high. The secondary explosion was a complete accident. I was lucky I had time for a follow-up." Hayes held her gaze for another 10 seconds. He knew they were lying. The ballistics didn't make sense. The tactical behavior didn't make sense. But he also knew the reality of modern warfare. The HVI was dead. The QRF was safe. The mission was a resounding, metric-driven success. Digging into the truth would only create paperwork, investigations, and political headaches for the brass. The military machine didn't want the messy, insubordinate truth. It wanted a clean narrative. Hayes closed the folder. "Well," the major said, leaning back in his chair, "sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. I'll finalize the AAR with the accidental cook-off narrative. Take 3 days of mandatory crew rest. You've earned it." He stood up, tucked the folder under his arm, and walked out of the room. The heavy metal door clicked shut behind him, sealing the lie into official military history. Collins let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 3 days. She slumped back in the folding chair, pressing the palms of her hands against her eyes until she saw bursts of static. "Thank you," she whispered into her hands. "Don't thank me," Croft said, standing up. The chair scraped loudly against the linoleum. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because I'm not going to let a desk jockey like Hayes dismantle this unit over a technicality. But understand this, Collins." She lowered her hands and looked up at him. "You're a phenomenal shooter," Croft said, his eyes hard and dead. "Maybe the best I've ever spotted for, but you are a liability. When we get back stateside, I'm transferring you out of my element. I can't have a weapon in my armory that decides when it wants to fire." He turned and walked toward the door. "Nolan," Collins called out. He paused, his hand on the brass handle. "If I hadn't taken that shot," she asked, the question clawing at the back of her throat, "would you have been able to sleep tonight?" Croft didn't turn around. He stood there for a long time, staring at the grey metal of the door. "No," he said quietly. Then he pushed the door open and walked out, leaving her alone in the freezing, sterile room. Virginia Beach in mid-October is a bizarre transition zone. The heavy, oppressive humidity of the summer burns off, leaving behind a crisp, salty chill rolling off the Atlantic. The tourist strips empty out, the neon signs reflecting off wet, vacant pavements, leaving the city to the locals and the massive, sprawling military apparatus that anchors it. Sarah Collins sat in a corner booth at a dive bar called The Anchor on Pacific Avenue. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The place was mostly empty, smelling of stale draft beer, old pine, and the faint scent of bleach used to mop away decades of spilled liquor. The only sounds were the low murmur of a sports broadcast on a muted television and the sharp, sudden clack of billiard balls from the back room. She was wearing a faded grey hoodie and worn denim. She held a glass of cheap bourbon in her right hand, rolling the condensation against her palm. It had been 4 months since the mountain. The physical scars had healed into thick, silvery keloids across her collarbone and knees. The military had given her a Navy Commendation Medal for the HV kill. They had pinned it to her chest in a brightly lit auditorium in Little Creek. Everyone clapped. She shook hands with an admiral whose palm was soft and dry. Then, exactly as Croft had promised, she was quietly reassigned. She was bumped from the Tier 1 kinetic strike element and moved to a training cadre. She was an instructor now. She spent her days lying on manicured grass ranges in North Carolina, teaching 19-year-old SEAL candidates how to calculate wind drift and read mirages through spotting scopes. She was safe. Her career was intact. She slept in a bed with clean sheets every night. She hated it. A civilian walked past her booth, bumping the edge of her table. The glass of bourbon rattled. The sudden, unexpected movement sent a spike of pure, electrified adrenaline straight into her nervous system. Collins's right hand shot out, her fingers wrapping around the heavy glass ashtray on the table, her body instantly tensing for violence. "Oh, my bad, miss," the guy said, holding up his hands apologetically. He was wearing a college sweatshirt and flip-flops. Just a kid. Collins stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She forced her fingers to slowly uncurl from the ashtray. "It's fine," she said. Her voice sounded completely normal, betraying nothing of the chaotic chemical storm raging inside her. The kid nodded and walked away to the bar. Collins took a slow, deep breath, trying to push the adrenaline back down. It was getting harder. Out there in the dirt, the hypervigilance kept you alive. Here, in the grocery store, in traffic, in a quiet bar, it was a parasite. It fed on the silence. She took a sip of the bourbon. It burned on the way down, a sharp, physical sensation that helped ground her in the present. She looked out the dirty front window of the bar. The ocean was visible between 2 cinder-block hotels, a strip of churning, grey water. Civilians think that returning from war is about leaving the battlefield behind. They think a soldier steps off the plane, hands back their rifle, and reintegrates into the polite fiction of society. But they do not. The geography changes, but the architecture of the brain does not. When Collins looked at the street outside, she didn't see cars and pedestrians. She saw defilades. She saw lines of sight. She calculated the elevation of the hotel balconies. She subconsciously tracked the wind moving through the traffic lights, estimating it at a half value, left to right, maybe 5 miles an hour. She was still on the mountain. She reached up and rubbed her right collarbone. The muscle there still ached when it rained, a phantom throb from the violent recoil of the .416 Barrett. The ringing in her right ear was constant now, a shrill, microscopic frequency that never stopped. In the quiet moments, it sounded exactly like the wind whipping through the jagged shale of the Hindu Kush. She had pulled the trigger to save lives. She had broken the rules to do the right thing. But the universe doesn't deal in morality. It deals in consequences. The consequence was that she was no longer a perfect machine. The consequence was the realization that the system she had given her body to was perfectly content to lie to protect itself, while discarding the people who actually bled for it. She took another sip of the bourbon. The television above the bar flashed to a breaking news segment. Another deployment, another convoy, another dusty piece of earth somewhere on the other side of the planet. Collins didn't look up. She traced the rim of her glass with her cracked index finger, the same finger that had applied 2.5 pounds of pressure to a piece of anodized aluminum. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't a villain. She was just a woman sitting in a dark bar, listening to the eternal, ringing silence, waiting for a command she knew was never going to come. The ice in her glass shifted, a sharp, sudden crack that sounded exactly like a bullet breaking the sound barrier. She didn't flinch. She just finished the drink, left a $20 bill on the sticky wood, and walked out into the cold, empty street, disappearing into the wind. This is the story of Sarah Collins, a sniper who had to choose between orders and humanity. Warfare isn't just about the physical trigger pull. It's about the agonizing mental weight of the aftermath. The hardest battles aren't fought in the mountains. They are fought in the quiet moments back home, where the echoes of consequence never truly fade. If this gritty, grounded look into the psychological toll of the battlefield resonated, hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates raw storytelling, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dive narratives. Stay sharp, everyone.